Welcome to this week's Belau Report. I'm Jane Belau. Our guests, we welcome back our State Senator Carla Nelson. And Carla, it doesn't get much hotter than this news when you're on your way to St. Paul. You come in the morning and we do our program and you're off to the cities.
Well, there's lots to do, and it's great to start right here on the Jane Belau Show, right here in Rochester. And I thank you for covering for so many years all of the political events and issues that have been so important to this part of the state and the world in general.
There was a political event, I think, in the Post Bulletin about the public options for health care, and it included this new mortality bill, which is one of, 10 states have them?
Yes, I think it's very troubling if you're talking about the physician, or I would say misnamed physician-suicide bill. There are a few states that have this, they call it physician-assisted suicide or dignity in dying, or they have other names for it. But the point is, I believe it goes against the Hippocratic Oath of our medical providers, in that they are hastening one's death. They are prescribing medication for one to commit suicide. And I think that's a challenge on many levels. But let's be clear, it's not about pain. Hospice, palliative care already is available to help people go through those painful end-of-life experiences. So the physician-assisted suicide bill is concerning because, number one, it puts at risk vulnerable Minnesotans, whether they be the elderly who don't want to be a burden on, as they would say, their loved ones, or our disabled community, or those who have high needs, high medical needs. And so that is not a new bill. It came before the legislature the last time that we had a full DFL control of all levels. Fortunately, at that point, we were able to scuttle that bill when it came to the Senate Health Committee that I served on. And we had many from this community, this medical community, who came up and testified against that bill that would authorize physicians to help people die.
Okay, is it going to be a partisan bill?
You know, I don't know. I would hope that there are some Democrats who would oppose that type of assisted suicide bill. But I don't know if all of my colleagues, all of my Republican colleagues, would support the stopping of that bill. I don't know. I would think so, though oftentimes these issues fall along partisan lines, but not always.
Okay, and what is the public option health bill?
Well, the public option health bill is really, as I understand, it hasn't been fully rolled out yet, but I understand the goal is to have more Minnesotans on government-sponsored, government-run health care. Of course, there's a couple problems with that. One is the government never really pays for what the true costs are. We can see that with Medicare, Medicaid. And then there's also the concern about squashing innovation. If we think about the innovation that's happened in the healthcare arena in the last few years, it is truly remarkable. And to think that a government agency would be responsible in setting price controls and in a sense, squashing the next medical innovation, I think would be very, very challenging. I think it would not be wise. We have some of the best health care, and yes, we want to make sure everybody has access to it, and yes, it's expensive, and we do have programs to help with those medical bills and hold those costs down as well. But I've never felt the government is the best arbiter of healthcare costs and what's available to Minnesotans.
Okay, so healthcare, though, is increasingly getting attention. The teachers union has this as one of their issues. What can be done?
Well, I think one of the fastest growing costs in the high cost of medical care is prescription drugs. Yeah. And we are seeing a lot of innovations in prescription drugs that are helping people live longer, healthier lives. However, there are some perverse incentives in our current laws that keep those lower cost prescription drugs, particularly biosimilars. It's kind of like the generic equivalent of a biologic drug. It's called biosimilar. And there's some perverse incentives in law that we should change that are keeping those lower cost biologics off of coverage by our health insurance companies. They choose not to use those lower cost biologic drugs because of the rebates that the drug companies send back to the insurance companies. And in Minnesota, those rebates do not go to the person paying the price. Those rebates go to the insurance company. And so that's a problem when insurance companies have an incentive to keep the most effective, lowest cost drugs off of the formulary. I do have a bill called Share the Rebates that other states have done that would eliminate that type of perverse incentive. That would be very helpful.
And what is the status of that bill?
I have introduced that in previous years. It will be alive this year as well. And I'd very much like to at least get a hearing on that, make sure the public is aware of this really perverse incentive that is really keeping these high-cost prescription drugs more costly. And along that line, there also is some legislation we need that would require equal coverage of those biosimilar drugs that are just like their very expensive biologic drugs, much like we have with generic drugs. We need to have a similar type legislation regarding biologics that we have for generic drugs. And we all know how those generic drugs have brought down the price. And so these newer class of drugs, these biologics, highly effective, life-changing drugs, but they're very expensive. So we need to make sure that Minnesotans have access, their insurance companies allow them to have access to the lower cost biosimilars, which are like generics.
And we just assume that that is so.
Yes, we do assume, and it took me a while to understand these internal drivers of the high cost of prescription drugs that we're not addressing in Minnesota.
And you're planning to introduce a bill again?
Yes, requiring a coverage for biosimilars, just like we have coverage for generic drugs.
Okay. What else in the healthcare industry or affecting our healthcare are being considered?
Well, Minnesota is really an innovator when it comes to healthcare in many ways. And so we have a good innovative state climate. It's called Medical Alley, kind of as a crescent moon that comes down from Minneapolis down 52 to Rochester. And we see a lot of medical innovations happening right here in our community. One of them you could think of is Viriad, where they're finding that things like the measles virus can actually be used to cure cancer in specific ways. And so that's a very simplified version. You definitely want to talk to Viriad to understand. But using innovative things such as CRISPR, which is dealing with, which I can't even understand, the cellular level, is actually changing outcomes. And we are seeing those innovations right here in Minnesota. Now, of course, they're much broader than Minnesota. So we're seeing things like that. We're seeing things like nanodropper, a new innovation here in Minnesota that has received already some angel investor funding. And it's looking at helping with, we think about the expensive drops that go in eyes, for example. And if you think about the size of those eye drops, they're usually splash over because they're so large. But the nanodropper is looking at a way to have the correct size of eye drop so that you don't spend money on medicine that you don't need, and also that actually is more effective. So there's a lot of, those are just a couple examples, there's many more of the innovations that are happening right here in Minnesota in our rich, innovative climate. And that's where I see bringing down healthcare costs and increasing healthcare outcomes is through innovation. And we're at the center of that.
Okay. How about the Equal Rights Amendment?
Well, we have equal rights in our state. The Equal Rights Amendment, I've supported that in the past. It all depends on how it's written. So we expect in Minnesota that women be treated equally as men. I expect that. Our state expects that, but sometimes that ERA amendment actually becomes more of a partisan political fodder. So it all depends on the language. So we'll have to see, you know, what the language looks like. Last year, the issue was there was a movement to a bill to support the ERA, although even Ruth Bader Ginsburg, prior to her death, said this would not work because they wanted to extend the deadline. So as you know, the states have a certain number of years at which there needs to be a significant ratification for an equal rights amendment. And that time frame has elapsed. And some people just wanted to say, well, we're just going to extend that time frame. But in reality, even as RBG said, you know, there needs to be an amendment passed federally, and then it comes to the states for ratification. So we'll see if the feds reopen that. We'll see what that language is, and then we'll examine what that means for Minnesota. Should Minnesota ratify that? It all depends on what the language says. Of course, we all expect women to be treated equal. We are long past the time where my mother, for example, was told she couldn't teach in the school district where my father was an administrator. Imagine that. Another friend of my mother's was told, well, you're pregnant, we can't have pregnant teachers in the classroom, but we can't get anyone else right now, so you just stay down at the end of this hallway. I'm just saying we have left that behind us, and we do want to make sure that women have every opportunity and equal pay. But then again, it's all semantic. What does that mean by equal pay? Does that prohibit a woman from taking off because she wants to be home with her child? I stayed out of the teaching profession for 10 years while we were raising our kids because I wanted to and I had the opportunity to. That doesn't mean it's right for every woman, but it also doesn't mean that I was discriminated against because I chose to stay home for 10 years.
Yeah, okay. Now, how about other health issues like environment?
Well, our environment is intricately tied to health. And I know there's been a lot of interest most recently, right here in this area again, Dodge County, Olmsted County, regarding water quality. And the challenge is that what we're seeing in water quality today, specifically looking at nitrates and the amount of nitrates in water, particularly, obviously, drinking water. And what we see today is a result of 20 years ago, of the practices 20 years ago. They're not the result of practices today. So we have to look at, number one, how to make sure the practices today are not contributing to unhealthy, unclean water, or more nitrates often is the case. And we also then have to look at how do we protect the groundwater? How do we make sure the water that people are ingesting is not full of the unsafe nitrates at unsafe levels? And so there's a lot more to look into how do we do that. But our farmers are farming very differently than they did 20 years ago. And so we need to make sure that the solutions that we look at affect what's happening today, and at the same time prevent the injury from practices that occurred 20 years ago.
And how about soil? I know our county is very concerned about soil, and we are a producing state when it comes to food. What about soil?
Well, when I think of soil, I think of the SWCDs. Those are soil water, I think control districts are what they're called, SWCDs. Every county is part of a SWCD. And in Olmsted County, I'm really proud of what we have been doing regarding our SWCDs are actually helping incent farmers to take new innovations. And again, we're seeing innovations in the ag industry too. Cover crops, dual cropping are critical things that are helpful in soil health and also help produce those returns for our farmers as well. So I think Olmsted County residents should be very, I hope they're aware of really the innovation that the Olmsted County SWCD is providing for our ag producers. I have visited some of those things. Some of them have to do with stopping erosion, stream runoff, as I said, innovative crops, and then the machinery to do that double cropping. So there are a lot of innovations in the ag industry, and I'm hoping that they continue, and I hope our county continues to lead.
How about education? That used to be one of your main interest areas.
Yes.
And now we have some local issues that are still in negotiation.
Yes, well, I think education is a top issue for everyone. Education is our future. It's essential that we have strong schools for all of our students, strong public schools. About 90% of our kids go to public schools. We want those to be strong schools. We also want to have strong options and choices for parents as well. There's a number of challenges. One big challenge, and a full disclosure, I'm a former reading specialist, reading teacher, but one of the challenges is when our kids are not learning to read. And in some of our schools, we have less than half our kids reading at grade level by 3rd grade. That's a key marker. Students need to learn to read before they leave 3rd grade. And then after 3rd grade, as you know, students actually, much of what they need to learn is through reading. And one of the things that we focused on when I was education chair, and the focus is continuing to grow, and that's really helpful, I think, is really focusing on the scientific development of reading, the science of reading. I was just visiting Rochester schools this past week in a school in Stewartville, and I was so pleased at what I saw. Actually, I was at one of our elementary schools. I saw how that school has embraced the science of reading. I saw it in the classrooms. I was in a classroom with kindergartners who were reading and writing. And I'm telling you, when I was teaching, kindergartners were not reading, they were learning their letters. These children knew the letters, they could write the letters, more importantly, they could read them when they were put together in words. And so when we can make sure that our kids are reading at grade level, then the world is their oyster. If you can read, you can do anything. You're not limited at all in what's possible. So that was concerning. And one of the things that did pass last year in the education bill that I think was critically important is the READ Act, which actually puts in law this focus on the science of reading. And that will pay great dividends for our kids. I'm excited to see how our Rochester schools are already adopting that. Now, there are some challenges, of course, that we have seen as well, which is not just in Rochester schools, but in general, we've seen declining scores, particularly in reading and math, which are very troubling. We've also seen declining enrollment. And that's kind of interesting. There's a lot of reasons why we see declining enrollment. Part of it, it should be no surprise. It didn't just sneak up on us. If you watch the birth rates, you'll see the birth rates have been declining. So that's not a surprise. It shouldn't surprise anyone. The state demographer is very clear about looking ahead what our population is. However, the challenge also is that, you know, we're seeing more and more kids. It's not a challenge, it's a choice. And there should always be a choice. Parents are experts in their own children, and they should have choices about where kids go to school. It might be their neighborhood school. It could be a public charter school. It could be a private school. It could be online schooling, whether it be at home, privately, or through the public school online learning. So there's a variety of options for parents, and we want to make sure that all of those remain open. One of my concerns that I'm just watching a little bit in the Rochester School District is that our very successful choice schools remain choice schools. In other words, Lincoln at Mann, highly successful. The 45-15 schedule at one of our elementary schools, highly successful. And I'm very much hopeful that all parents now have access to those schools, just like they do now, choice schools. Currently, the school district, of course, if you live in the Rochester School District, transportation is provided to those choice schools. I don't know if that's still in the works or not. I certainly hope so. To be a choice school, you really do have to make sure that all parents have access to that choice, and that would include transportation. So we'll see how that works out.
Okay, and we can't ignore the budget. This is a shorter session because it's a bonding year. And what is being done to assure that all the things that need to be bonded are bonded, and those that aren't, don't?
Well, that will be the question of the session, Jane, is what will be bonded for and what will not. But as we look to that, we have to know what happened last year. As was written in the Min Post, which is a nonpartisan news source that covers the legislature extensively, particularly in their session or their article right after session last year, they talked about the massive explosive growth in state government spending. And in fact, their words were they did not just break spending records, they smashed them. The reason I say that is because what happened last year has a great effect, obviously, on this session and going forward. And last year in the budget session, where we set the 2-year budget, the legislature unbelievably increased state spending by 40%. 40% increase in state spending. Totally shocking. So that took a $19 billion surplus and turned it into spend it all plus increasing taxes by $10 billion to balance off all that spending. So we have to know that. Now, so when it comes to this bonding year this year, there's always more requests than there are dollars to go around. Of course, especially when there was such expensive massive spending last year. So what that means is that the amount of money that was set aside in the budget for bonding for this year, we should not be going over that. And the number is somewhere in the 800 million range. And that, I believe, when you look at bonding, you should look at obviously just state assets and things that deal with public safety, things that deal with clean water, things that deal with roads and bridges. I see those as safety issues. And then those local projects that are important as well. So I'll really be focused on public safety as well as economic development.
Okay, so Do we locally have some bonding bills?
We do. Some very important ones regarding transportation. You know, last year we were able to get the funding for Highway 14 and that intersection at what was CASA 44 or 140. The good news is we were able to get all of that funding. That was one of my proposals that passed. I'm so happy. Now, what's happening there is happening further as you go west on 14 as well. Those county roads that intersect further west, like County 3 and County 5, just like outside of Byron, you know, they're continuing to get that heavy traffic as well. And so one of the bonding proposals of mine is to make sure that we get the funding for both those intersections, 3 and 5 as well. Also, there is just a small segment of road in Stewartville, again, that's just getting overrun. It's a township road, half township, half city. And 60% of the road budget for that township maintenance is spent on that one little mile of road because it is so overused, they have to continually regrade that. So looking for some bonding dollars there. And then there's a similar situation over in Dodge Center as well, where there's just about 2 miles of road that are some township funded, some city funded, and the roads are so bad that the trucks that are actually produced in that site can't even travel on the public roads because the roads cannot handle the weight. So the roads are just in disrepair. So hopefully we'll get those bonding projects in there for those safe roads. Then, of course, we're looking at, I think it's kind of an innovative thing. The Rochester International Airport, you know, serves the whole southern tier of the state, great economic development, health, you know, we get all those plane loads of samples in every day that have health consequences for people. We need to get those tested right away. And so the Rochester Airport is looking at some covered parking, which obviously helps if you're pushing wheelchairs in the wintertime from your car to get into the hangar. But I like the innovation in that they're not just thinking about covered parking. Part of that covered parking, that's going to be solar panels. And the solar panels are kind of anticipated, we'll have to see, but it looks like it's going to nearly replace the energy resources needed to run the terminal. So it's kind of like getting two things at once, trying to help with the parking, especially in our winter. This winter's maybe a bit of an exception, and then also offload some of the energy costs. So I think that's an innovative project, and I'm looking forward to getting movement on that. Of course, we have some local projects at Graham Park. You know, there's been a lot about the stadium there and the seats not being safe. In fact, they've been taken down now, and what's going to go there. I will say I do like to see what's happened at Graham Arena or Graham Park now. The farmers market is wildly successful, and the number of the community events that are being held year round. And so I think it's important that important asset in the middle of our community really is used year round. So that those are some of those projects as well.
In the last 2 minutes that we have, would you like to remind our people of issues? What's important to watch?
Sure. Thank you, Jane. You know, there's a number of things that I would encourage listeners just to watch as the legislation is taking hold this year. No, again, it's a short session. It is not a budget session because, as you know now, we passed a large budget last year that was a 40% increase in state spending for the next 2 years. And so I think it's important to watch the cost of things that are coming through the legislature, number one. And then secondly, it's important to really look at those projects and are those things that are important to the state of Minnesota? And can we monitor the funding? For example, Minnesota has continually had fraud and abuse in the very generous things that Minnesotans have been provided. We have to really ramp down on that and make sure that there isn't fraud and abuse in any state dollar. When it comes to bonding this year, I do think it's important that we take care of the assets that Minnesota taxpayers have already purchased. You know, it hurts me when I see buildings that have been, for some reason, they've not been kept up. We know that they just get worse. If there's a hole in the roof, you fix it. You don't let it continue to leak. That's just a very broad example, but we do need to take care of those assets that Minnesotans already own. I think it's just good stewardship. So those things are important. And then, of course, there's the controversial things that I think Minnesotans are going to watch. I hope they watch. You know, we talked about the misnamed physician-to-suicide bill, and I hope Minnesotans are watching that. I think we have to hold our legislators accountable. And I can use an example of the flag. So this past year, there's kind of been a troubling trend where things that should be voted on in the legislature, so Minnesotans can hold their legislator accountable, are suddenly being shoved off into these unelected, politically appointed committees. One of them has to do with the new state flag. I don't believe an unelected political committee should have decided that. I think either all Minnesotans should have been able to vote on that, or the elected representatives, we should have voted on that, and our citizens, our constituents could hold us accountable for our vote.
Is it too late?
Well, it's too late because that's the law that was passed, that this unelected, politically appointed committee would pick a flag design. And again, I think that's usurping the public's right to hold their legislators accountable. So, and then there's the cost. Just here in Olmsted County, I talked to the sheriff a couple nights ago. Do you know the cost just to change all those flags on uniforms, cars, all the state seals on state buildings? We tried to ask for numbers, nobody knew in the legislature. Just here in Olmsted County, $500,000 just to change out the flags. Hennepin County, $1 million. It's just kind of a waste of money that wasn't well vetted. And again, it was a troubling trend, taking that accountability away from the legislators.
Okay, Carla, Nelson, thank you for taking time on your way to St. Paul to do the Lord's work in the legislature. We appreciate your representation and your reports.
Thank you, Jane. It's just a real joy to be here.
And we thank our viewers for your interest in the legislature, taxes, and all kinds of things that the legislature affects. And we'll be with you again next week, same time, same channel. Have a very good week.